All right, so are you ready to dive into a world where charisma and controversy, well, they just go hand in hand?
Let's do it.
Because today's episode, we are tackling the question visionary leader or master manipulator.
Ooh.
And I asked you to look into this one, and you sent me a stack of articles about Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Yeah, I did.
We've got the New Yorker, the NY Post, even Benzinga and PolitiFact chiming in.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. Yeah, and it's very clear that she sparks strong opinions from a lot of people.
Right.
So we're going to try to unpack her career, her tactics, that undeniable knack that she has for making headlines, and answer the question, is she genuinely changing the world, or is this all just a clever act for a personal gain?
It's a question that I think a lot of folks are asking, especially given her, I think what some people call like a meteoric rise to a position of power in politics.
Right, and influence.
Yeah, and what I think is so fascinating about her story is that, when you look at her background before entering Congress, she owned a CrossFit gym, and then she was involved in her family's construction business.
Right.
So we don't see like a long history of political activism or, really major fundraising efforts leading up to this moment.
Right. I think in 2020, she even put a significant chunk of her own money, like $1.4 million, into her congressional campaign.
Yeah.
So she was, putting her money where her mouth was, but then things took a really sharp turn after that, and her fundraising just exploded.
It did.
What happened?
Well, this is what's so interesting, right? It's almost like a case study in how to turn controversy into cash.
Okay.
Almost immediately after winning her seat, a bunch of, pretty inflammatory statements and actions came to light.
Right.
We saw everything from, calling for violence against political opponents to her support for QAnon to, those space laser theories.
Yeah.
It was just one headline after another.
Those space lasers.
I know. They definitely raised some eyebrows.
Yeah.
But instead of like backfiring the way that you might expect, for a lot of politicians, this would just be career suicide.
Yeah.
It seemed to boost her fundraising.
Really?
And then she was even stripped of her committee assignments, which, again, for most politicians, this would be a major setback. But for Greeno, it just kind of fueled this image of her as an outsider.
Right.
Someone who's being silenced by the establishment.
Right. She's a victim.
Exactly. And that really resonated with a certain segment of the population.
Solely.
She started sending out all these fundraising emails saying that she was under attack and she needed support to defend herself. And people responded.
Yeah.
Big time they did.
Yeah.
She went from using $1.4 million of her own money to raising $3.2 million in the first quarter of 2021.
Wow.
And a lot of that was in small donations, which suggests that this wasn't just, a few wealthy donors.
Right.
This was a grassroots movement, people who really believed in her message.
Yeah. It's almost like a case study in the power of the internet and social media in politics in general, I feel like.
Absolutely. Platforms like ActBlue and WinRed have just completely changed the game, right?
Yeah.
It makes it so easy for candidates to tap into a network of small donors, and those donors are often driven by strong emotions.
Right.
Whether it's enthusiasm or anger or fear, and we've seen this before, right? Like when Joe Wilson shouted "You lie" at President Obama during a speech, his campaign was flooded with donations, like almost instantly.
It's so wild.
Yeah.
It is so wild.
It's like this fascinating phenomenon. The more extreme the position, the more provocative the stance, the more attention it generates.
Right.
And it seems like the more donations come in, and Greene just appears to understand this dynamic perfectly.
She's currently the House Republican receiving the highest proportion of full donations. So like 77% of the $4.4 million she's raised has come from those smaller contributions.
Yeah. It's a lot.
That's wild, especially considering she's running in a district that's already solidly Republican.
Right.
So, it's not like she's fighting an uphill battle in terms of like, name recognition or,
right.
Or anything like that. So it's really interesting. And it leads to the question, what's the end game here? Like, is this just about securing re-election, or is she building a platform, a movement?
Right.
A war chest for something bigger?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Speaking of future goals, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about her recent campaign against Speaker Mike Johnson.
Okay.
She has been very, very vocal about wanting to oust him.
Yeah.
And her motives have been questioned.
Yeah.
To put it lightly.
Yeah.
She's criticized him for reaching spending agreements with Democrats, for supporting the aid package for Ukraine.
Right.
Even go so far as to call him a sellout.
Right.
These are pretty serious accusations.
Yeah.
Especially coming from within her own party.
Yeah.
And of course, she's been using this controversy to fuel yet another wave of online fundraising appeals.
Of course.
One email that I saw called Johnson a sellout, who bends the knee to communist Democrats.
Wow.
Strong language.
Yeah, very strong.
But is it genuine outrage or is it a calculated tactic?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
Is this real or is this just part of the, the performance?
Right.
Some political analysts have suggested that her crusade against Johnson might actually be less about principle and more about, you guessed it, fundraising.
Oh, come on.
I know.
Right.
Right? They argue that she's just exploiting this controversy to tap into that same vein of anger and distrust towards the establishment that we were talking about earlier.
It's cynical, but it kind of makes sense.
It does.
Given her history.
I know Ron Bonjean, who's a political strategist, put it pretty bluntly. He said it's very clear that this is not about principle. It is about campaign money.
Wow.
Yeah.
So he's just calling it out.
Straight up.
Straight up, yeah. It's definitely something to consider, I think.
Yeah.
So we're seeing this pattern of turning outrage into opportunity, but there's a layer to this I think we need to unpack, and I think it's campaign finance reform. Because you'd think that, like, limiting large donations would lead to less of this kind of behavior.
All right.
But it seems like the opposite is happening.
Yeah, you've hit on a really important point. I think the push for campaign finance reform, which was intended to empower everyday citizens and diminish the influence of big money,
Yeah.
might have inadvertently contributed to the rise of candidates like Greene.
Wait, really explain that to me. I don't really follow.
So by limiting the amount of money that individuals or corporations can contribute to major parties, we may have actually weakened their control over more extreme or unpredictable members. Those members can now kind of bypass the party establishment and appeal directly to a base of small donors who are energized by their provocative stances.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
Right.
We wanted to limit the influence of big money, but in doing so, we may have empowered a new breed of politician who thrives on controversy and outrage.
Exact.
Oh, that's so interesting.
And let's not forget about the rise of outside groups, often with undisclosed donors.
Right.
Which can spend unlimited sums to support or attack candidates, and this just complicates the picture even more.
Right.
It makes it harder to track the flow of money and influence.
It's like we're trying to plug one hole in a leaky boat and we just created a bunch of new ones.
I like that analogy. Yeah, and it's in this chaotic landscape that figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene are really flourishing.
Right.
They understand how to exploit the system, how to manipulate the media, and how to tap into the emotions of a really deeply divided electorate.
Yeah, and that brings us to another interesting comparison, I think, which is Greene and her so-called hero and patron, Donald Trump.
Yes.
Because they both have proven remarkably adept at turning controversy into fundraising gold.
Yeah, it's a playbook, right? It relies on provocation, attention-grabbing headlines, and just this direct appeal to a base that feels ignored or even threatened by the so-called establishment.
Right.
So they're speaking to a certain audience.
And Greene seems to have studied that playbook very closely.
Yeah.
Even down to her choice of advisors.
Right. Her decision to hire Ed Buckham as her chief of staff is pretty telling, I think.
Oh, sure.
Buckham is a strategist who's known for his aggressive tactics, and he has close ties to Tom DeLay,
Okay.
the former House Majority Leader who was also known for, challenging party leadership from the right and using campaign funds to kind of exert his influence.
DeLay was definitely a master of the game, but his career also ended in scandal.
Yeah.
Which highlights the potential risks of this approach.
Right. There's always a risk that it's going to backfire.
Do you think Greene is headed down a similar path?
I don't know. It remains to be seen, I guess.
Yeah.
But what is clear is that she's walking a tightrope, right? She's balancing her ambition and her commitment to her base with the potential consequences of, alienating potential allies and pushing the boundaries of acceptable political behavior.
This is getting good.
Right.
I think we need to take a deeper look at her strategic alliances.
Let's do it.
And how those have shifted over time, because it's a wild ride.
Buckle up. Welcome back. We were just starting to kind of unpack Marjorie Taylor Greene's strategic alliances, and I think it's safe to say that they have been anything but straightforward.
No kidding. It's like watching a high-stakes game of political chess.
Totally.
With alliances forming and fracturing at like a dizzying pace.
Yeah, her relationship with the House Freedom Caucus is a great example.
Okay.
So she was initially a member of this ultra-conservative group, but they actually kicked her out in 2023.
Wait, they kicked her out of the Freedom Caucus?
They did.
What, was she not extreme enough for them or something?
Well, apparently even among a group that's known for its, hardline stance, there are limits.
Okay.
And it seems like her tendency to just publicly attack fellow conservatives didn't sit well with them.
Interesting.
But, this expulsion didn't really sideline Greene in the way that they might have hoped. Instead, she just kind of pivoted and formed what seemed like this unlikely alliance with Kevin McCarthy, who was fighting to secure the speakership at the time.
That was a surprising move to me.
Yeah.
Because McCarthy and Greene just seem like they come from completely different wings of the Republican Party.
Right.
What was the strategy there?
Well, I think, McCarthy desperately needed support from the hardliners in order to become speaker.
Okay.
And Greene saw an opportunity to kind of increase her own influence.
I see.
It was a mutually beneficial arrangement, at least in the short term.
For sure.
Tom DeLay, the former House Majority Leader, actually suggested that Greene's support for McCarthy was purely strategic.
And DeLay knows a thing or two about political maneuvering, so
He does,
that's
yeah.
a pretty insightful take, I think.
Right, and he said that she wanted to be a real player, and she recognized that, aligning herself with McCarthy, at least temporarily, could really elevate her position within the party. He even hinted that he saw the influence of Ed Buckham, her chief of staff, and DeLay's former advisor in this.
Right, right.
So, there's some history there.
It makes you wonder.
Yeah.
So it was a calculated gamble, and it seems like it paid off, at least in the short term.
It did.
But as we know, McCarthy's speakership was pretty short-lived.
Yeah.
He was brought down by that rebellion led by Matt Gaetz.
Right. Another figure who's made a career out of challenging the establishment.
Yes, he has.
And just like Greene, he used that rebellion to fuel his own fundraising efforts.
So there's a pattern here.
There is.
Use controversy even within your own party to grab headlines, bring in donations.
Get that money.
But where does principle fit into all of this?
That is the question, right?
Yeah.
Gaetz was accused of using the motion to vacate McCarthy's position, which is essentially a procedural move to remove the speaker,
Right.
as a fundraising ploy. And now Greene is doing something very similar with McCarthy's successor, Mike Johnson.
So she's trying to oust Johnson for the same budget deal that she defended McCarthy on just a few months ago.
It certainly seems that way. I mean, she's been, slamming him for reaching spending agreements with Democrats, for supporting aid to Ukraine, calling him a sellout.
Wow.
The same label that she used for McCarthy.
It's almost like the specific policies don't even matter.
Right.
It's all just about generating outrage.
Yeah.
And capitalizing on it.
Exactly.
Especially when you consider that even some of her Republican colleagues are calling her out on this.
Yeah, Greg Murphy, who's a fellow representative, claimed that Greene literally texted him
Oh, wow.
about wanting to raise money on this motion to vacate Johnson.
So her own party members are skeptical of her motives.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty damning.
Yeah, it really underscores this central question that we keep coming back to,
It does.
which is, are her actions driven by genuine conviction? Or is it all just a calculated performance designed to boost her profile and her bank account?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer definitively. But I think it's important to acknowledge that even if her tactics are, maybe questionable, they've been remarkably effective.
Right. She's generating buzz, she's building a loyal following, and she's amassing a significant amount of money.
Right. And that gives her power.
It does.
Whether we like it or not.
Whether we like it or not, so she's doing something right, or at least effectively.
Yeah, I mean, she understands how to leverage the current media landscape where outrage and controversy just often overshadow substance.
Yeah.
And she's tapped into a very specific segment of the electorate that feels alienated and distrustful of the political establishment.
Right.
And she speaks directly to their fears and frustrations.
It's smart.
It is.
But at what cost?
That's the question.
Is she alienating potential allies?
Right.
Is she further dividing the Republican Party?
Yeah, and what happens if this strategy ultimately backfires?
Right.
I mean, those are crucial questions.
Yeah.
There's a risk that her kind of scorched earth approach could leave her isolated and weaken her ability to actually enact the changes that she claims to want.
Right.
But there's also a possibility that she's playing a much longer game,
Yeah.
that she's strategically positioning herself for, a future leadership role.
Right.
Or even a run for higher office.
A presidential run.
I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
It's all speculation at this point. But one thing is for sure, Marjorie Taylor Greene is a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, speaking of forces to be reckoned with, we can't talk about Greene without mentioning the elephant, or perhaps the mammoth in the room.
Oh, boy.
Donald Trump. He recently came out in support of Speaker Johnson.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's a significant development for sure. I mean, Trump's endorsement could potentially weaken Greene's leverage
Right.
and really complicate her efforts to oust Johnson.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how she responds to this challenge.
It's almost as if she's trying to build a movement that mirrors Trump's.
Right.
But now she has to contend with the original master of the game.
Exactly. And it's a game that she's playing on a very public stage.
Yeah.
With her every move being, scrutinized and analyzed.
It's fascinating to watch.
It is.
Despite the controversies, she's also proven to be, a valuable asset for the party in terms of fundraising.
Right.
I mean, she's transferred significant sums to the National Republican Congressional Committee and other campaigns, which gives her a certain level of clout.
Yeah. I mean, even if some party leaders disagree with her tactics or her rhetoric, they can't deny her effectiveness in bringing in the cash.
It's complicated.
It is a very complicated dynamic.
Yeah, it speaks to this broader issue of how money influences politics.
Right.
In a system where campaigns are increasingly expensive.
Yeah.
Those who can raise large sums of money, regardless of how they do it, wield considerable power.
Right. And it makes you wonder if principle and genuine public service are taking a backseat to the pursuit of money and power.
It's disheartening a little bit.
It is a valid concern. But let's not lose sight of the fact that, Greene is also tapping into something very real.
Okay.
This deep sense of frustration and disillusionment among a segment of the population who feel like their voices aren't being heard.
Right. And that feeling of being unheard is something that we need to acknowledge and address.
Absolutely.
But is Greene the right person to channel that frustration? Is she offering genuine solutions?
Yeah.
Or is she just exploiting those feelings for her own gain?
That's the question we've been grappling with this whole time. I don't think there's an easy answer.
Well, let's delve into that a bit deeper.
Okay.
Let's look at her actual policy positions.
Let's do it.
And try to figure out what she really stands for. Because I think that'll give us some more clues.
Yeah, that's a good place to start.
We've been unpacking Marjorie Taylor Greene's rise and her controversial tactics and that knack she has for turning outrage into influence.
Right.
But I think the question is, are her policy positions just as provocative as, everything else that she does?
Well, she's definitely staked out some pretty hardline positions.
Yeah.
On immigration, for example, she's called for a complete border wall and much stricter enforcement measures.
Which aligns with her America First rhetoric. But
exactly.
what about other issues like healthcare? That's a major issue for a lot of voters.
Yeah, she's been a vocal critic of the Affordable Care Act.
Okay.
Advocating for its repeal and replacement with a more market-driven system.
And on climate change, which is another issue that's increasingly dividing the country.
Yeah, Greene has expressed a lot of skepticism about climate change, questioning the scientific consensus, opposing government regulations that are aimed at addressing it.
So her policy positions are pretty consistent with this image of her as like a conservative firebrand. But
for sure.
How do these positions resonate with her base? Like the people who are donating to her campaigns?
Well, I think it's a complex mix of factors at play here.
Yeah.
Some people are drawn to her just unwavering stance on issues that they care deeply about. Whether it's border security or gun rights or religious freedom,
Right.
They see her as a fighter, someone who isn't afraid to challenge the status quo and speak truth to power.
Right.
Even if that means, alienating some people along the way.
Right. They see her as authentic.
Exactly. They see her as someone who's not afraid to say what she thinks.
And not afraid to ruffle some feathers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think others might be motivated by just a sense of frustration or anger with the current political system.
Okay.
They feel ignored by the establishment and they see Greene as a voice for their discontent.
Like she's speaking for the people who feel like they don't have a voice.
Exactly. And let's not forget the impact of social media and the rise of echo chambers, right?
Right, yeah.
Where people are exposed primarily to information that confirms their existing beliefs. And this just creates a feedback loop.
It does.
Reinforcing those beliefs and making it harder to engage in constructive dialogue with people who hold different views.
It's so true.
So in a way, Greene's success kind of reflects this broader societal trend.
Yeah.
This polarization of viewpoints and just like a breakdown of civil discourse.
So it's bigger than her.
It's much bigger than her.
It's about like this almost societal shift.
Exactly. It's less about, specific policy positions and more about tapping into this deep well of emotion and resentment.
And that raises some important questions for all of us.
It does.
Like, how do we bridge these divides?
Yeah.
How do we engage in meaningful conversations about complex issues without resorting to just outrage and personal attack.
Right? It's a challenge.
It's a huge challenge.
But it's a challenge that we need to address if we want to move forward as a society.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't just ignore the frustrations and fears that are driving people to support figures like Greene.
Right.
We need to listen to them, understand their concerns, and try to find common ground.
It's about seeing each other as human beings.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if we don't agree on everything.
Right. And recognizing that, even though we might disagree on specific policies, we all share a common goal.
Hopefully.
Right? Which is a better future for our country.
Yeah.
And that starts with commitment to civil discourse, to listening with empathy, and to seeking solutions rather than just scoring political points.
Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of Marjorie Taylor Greene, what's the final verdict, grifter, gifted, visionary, or manipulator?
Oh, man. And, it's not a simple yes or no answer, I don't think.
Right.
There's evidence to support both sides of the argument. I mean, she's undeniably savvy. She understands the power of social media, outrage culture, targeted messaging. She's built a platform and a loyal following by tapping into, a deep vein of frustration and anger within a certain segment of the population. But whether she's genuinely committed to the principles she espouses or simply using them as tools for personal gain, that remains a topic of debate.
And that's okay. I don't think this deep dive was about reaching a definitive conclusion.
Right.
It was more about exploring the complexities of a really polarizing figure and the forces that have shaped her rise.
I think so, too.
It's about understanding the dynamics at play in our current political landscape.
Yes.
And encouraging critical thinking.
Absolutely.
About the choices that we make as voters and as citizens.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And ultimately, it's up to each of us to decide what we make of Marjorie Taylor Greene and her role in American politics.
Right. We've given you the information. Now you decide.
So, as always, we encourage you to continue the conversation, read the sources, engage in, thoughtful discussions, and form your own opinions.
Yeah.
This deep dive has just scratched the surface.
Right.
And there's always more to learn.
Always.
More to question and more to discuss.
Exactly. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
And we'll see you next time.